Good morning, good evening, and good night to all. This is Reading in Solitude, and I'm your host of Reading in Solitude. After writing for about 2 or 3 weeks straight and doing my last story, I thought it would be a good time for me to go ahead and discuss creative writing or fanfiction writing, and go ahead and talk about the process with which I go through in order to write my stories. Now, these two styles of writing are very similar, and though there certainly are differences, I think the general process that I'm going to suggest to everyone can be applied to both. Please bear in mind that not all people may find this process workable for them. However, it is very important that one has a process to avoid a number of key issues that I see a lot in people's creative writing and fanfiction writing. These issues include, but certainly are not limited to, disjointed chapters, unsteady or a lack of character development, and poor plot development. I think these issues most often stem from a lack of planning and people who just sit down and write a whole story at once, which is doable, but if you do it that way, you need to edit more than if you plan a bit, right? But I think that the lack of planning most often comes, and I'm going to diverge a little bit from my topic here, but this is a sort of cautionary piece of advice. I think most often it comes from people posting chapters episodically. Now, posting chapters episodically is not necessarily a bad thing. However, writing them and posting them at the same time is an issue when you're doing this episodically. So if you're just writing one chapter at a time and publishing that, that's really where the issue comes in. And it doesn't really matter where you publish your work, whether you publish it here on YouTube or you publish it on, say, fanfiction.net, or Wattpad, Fiction Press, Archive of Our Own. All these different story forums all have the same issue because they all allow you to publish and update your story over time. And the issue is that people will use this and think, well, I can just write one chapter at a time. It does suck to have to wait a really long time to write your story all out at once, but I can really guarantee you that it will help you so much in keeping everything together, keeping your characterization going well, keeping your plot developing evenly, and making sure that you don't have any loose ends that are left free. Now, you can do it the other way. It's going to take a lot more focus and a lot more care to make sure that you don't run into these issues. Because when you do this poorly, when you post and write chapters episodically and over time, it makes all the above issues so easy to manifest because you're going to be straining yourself to really try and connect all the pieces. And most people just can't do it. Some people can, and that's fine. If you can do this, then by all means go ahead. But if you're really having trouble and you're seeing a lot of people who review your work saying, hey, look, this isn't working, this isn't connecting, this isn't lining up. And I understand most of the time reviews are just, oh man, I love your story, keep going. Oh man, can we please get a sex scene later on? Reviews are very rarely helpful. But if you're finding either, again, due to reviews, due to people letting you know, or just due to you going back and reading your stories, you see that any of these issues are appearing. The lack of character development, the lack of plot development, or having chapters which just don't fit in with one another. Try writing your stories out all at once and then publishing them all at once, or again, you can publish them one chapter at a time, but you have the whole story written out. Now, with all that being said, this is the process by which I write my stories. Oftentimes, stories for me come simply from ideas which come to me when I'm running, shopping, driving, working, or just doing anything in general, really. From here, I'll often take a week of just playing around with this idea before finally storyboarding. Storyboarding in this sense is not exactly the same as an animator storyboard, but rather, it's more so just you coming up with different scenes in your head, or you can also write them out on paper if you want a hard copy, about things that might be in your story. For example, certain characters that you want to see in a story, certain archetypes you want to see in a story, certain interactions you might want to see in that story. And so that's really what this storyboarding process is about. After you get that storyboarding process done, then you can start putting your scenes into groups for chapters. Now, before I move on to writing chapters, I might also do some research regarding the topic that I'm writing about. This can be applicable to both fanfiction and creative writing. If you don't understand a topic, it's important that you come to some understanding. or perhaps simply just avoid writing about something that you have no knowledge of. It's not going to help your reader's immersion into your story if you're talking about things which you really don't know about and you can't really explain. Now, obviously, if you're writing something like science fiction or fantasy that there's no established knowledge of, all of the knowledge of that world comes from you, then that's not really an issue. But in this time where I would be doing research on something that is real, you might want to spend that time world building and coming up with different rules for that world. Again, if you're writing a fantasy or a science fiction type of thing. All of these things help because what it will do is allow you to set rules for your story. You're not going to be just making things up as you go because the plot needs you to do this. If you have rules that you can't break and you see that you need to go in a certain direction, you're going to have to find ways around those rules that make sense within the context of the story, and that will make your story much more exciting. Now, writing chapters will often take me anywhere from 2 to 3 weeks, followed up by a week set aside just for the beginning and the end of the story. These parts to your story are vital as they will bring readers in and leave them with the message that you mean to impart. Now, for me, when I'm writing, what I'll do is I'll simply write each chapter freely. I'll know what I want to talk about in that chapter, but I'm not going to set, paragraphs, plan paragraphs, stuff like that. But I do give myself a limit of 1.5 pages in order to keep myself from straying too far from the chapter's topic. Now, this is not a hard limit, right? So if I need to go over 1.5 pages, I'll go over 1.5 pages. If I don't have 1.5 pages of content, I'm not going to fill those 1.5 pages. I'm not going to force myself to do it. However, more often than not, if I don't have 1.5 pages, I will go back through, look through, and make sure that I added all the detail that I needed to. If everything that needs to be there is there, I'll leave it alone. Otherwise, I don't really worry about these things until I come back in the editing phase. So that brings us into our next part, editing. Here, one will read over his or her own story to make sure that chapters transition to one another, to make sure that all is well grammatically and syntactically, and finally to make sure that all the plot and character arcs are completed. You need to make sure that everything is good, and I would really recommend that you take 2-3 days away from your story in total. Don't even look at it, don't read it, don't think about it, just take some time away from it, come back to it 2 or 3 days later, and read through it. All in one go, read through the whole thing, and really think about how did that read? How did it go? If it was hard to read it, if it didn't make sense, go back through and edit it. And one of the things that really helps me is reading it out loud. Now, I know that I write my stories to be read out loud, but even stories that I mean to be read on paper or to be read through text, what I'll do is I'll talk to myself. I'll read it to myself. And one of my amazing English teachers, she's wonderful. She told me this method, and what she said is what you can do is when you're reading something against a table, if you look down at it and you cup your ears and read, it'll sound like you're reading it at a full volume. And so what this helps you do is when you hear these words that you're saying, does everything make sense? Because the brain has the ability to make sense of things that don't make sense, right? If you read something that is misspelled or is poorly written, your brain can make all the corrections that it needs to make sure that everything sounds good to you. However, when you're hearing it, it's not as easy to do that. And when you're reading it, you're really more engaged with the text. You're making sure that you read it correctly, and it'll really help you again, get a good understanding of, is my story written well? So now you're ready to publish. You can choose from any number of fiction sites to publish to, or you can do as I do and simply publish your stories to YouTube as audiobooks. However you choose to do so, it is important that you write to fit the medium with which you are publishing. This is a topic that I will discuss in greater detail next week, but what I mean by this is, if your story is meant to be published to be read out loud, it should be written in such a way. If you're trying to write an audio drama, then you should write it in the format of an audio drama. If you're trying to write a novel, you should not be writing a play. So really be sure of the type of work that you want to do, and again, make sure that you fit your style of writing to the medium that it will be published in. With all that being said, I hope you are well, and I bid you all a good night.